listening to Treasure Coast Solutions with Mark Brechbill, who is on his way into the studio, I hope. And in the meantime, we've got a little bit of our friend George Costanza, who thinks he should have been an architect. All right, we'll try that again. Here we go.
What do you do?
I'm an architect. Oh. I'm an architect.
Have you designed any buildings in New York?
Have you seen the new addition to the Guggenheim?
You did that?
Yep. It didn't take very long either. What about architect, Steve? He's into architecture.
Hey, just like you pretend to be.
Let me be the architect. I can do it. Look, why couldn't you make me an architect? You know I always wanted to pretend that I was an architect. I'm an architect.
Really? Well, what are you designing?
Railroads.
I thought engineers do that.
They can.
You. Very knowledgeable.
And now for the star of the show, Mark Brechbill. Take it away, Mark.
Well, good morning, and thanks for joining us here on Community Solutions. Well, actually, Treasure Coast Solutions this week. Community Solutions will be next week, I believe.
Next week, indeed, yeah.
So, for those of you that are new to the show, on the last Wednesday of the month, we typically have the United Way in for our Community Solutions program. They will talk to us about some of the things that are going on in the community, some of the things that are happening around town, especially as season picks up. And usually that's either the last Wednesday or the fourth Wednesday, depending upon who's available and when we can get them in, because sometimes, different weeks work out differently for people. But we are, but on the rest of the time, we have our Treasure Coast Solutions programming, and that is the program today where we talk about some of the issues that are going on in the world relative to finance and to, the issues as economics, finance. Not a financial planning show, although hopefully some of the stuff we talk about will help you in your financial planning and give you some, some help up with some of the things you're doing. But generally just discussing some of the national or international issues that might take place or are taking place, some of the things locally or maybe countywide or statewide that may have an impact on you and your pocketbook or you and the way you live. So that's what the program's about. It's we welcome participation. 220-9788, 220-WSTU. Again, that's 220-9788 is the number in the studio. You can call. Frank will pick up and we'll get you on. We just ask that you can have whatever opinion you want. If it disagrees with me, it's wrong opinion, but you're allowed to have it still.
Disagreeable opinions are desired.
Right. We accept those.
Yes.
We don't agree with them, but we accept them.
Yes.
But no, we like to hear. And of course, we have a lot of people around town and in this area that have a really good background, some practical experience, some actual academic experience, and we always welcome their input. So feel free to call. The 220-9788 and the 220-WSTU, the same number, of course, is a number that you can use for any of the times you're trying to get through to the studio. And a lot of the shows on WSTU are open for calls and do take calls. Some of the shows may not, but most of them do. And so they welcome those kind of that kind of interaction, as we do. So we value your comments and opinions and any kind of information you might have. And particularly sometimes there's topics that come up and, we don't have all the information yet. and there's others out there that specialize in that area and that do have the information. So we welcome that, including economics. My name is Mark Brechbill. I'm a CPA and an ex-banker. Spent 13 or 14 years and 15 years in the banking industry, starting banks at one point in time, and have done a lot of that type of thing. I was CFO of a $500 million bank at one point. And so, I've had an opportunity to deal in the big banking, small banking, and in the world of economics and finance for some period of time. Been a CPA most of my adult life. Had my own firm for the last 25 years here in Stewart. We do a lot of audit work. We do a lot of tax work. I do a lot of business tax planning, including generational business transfers and things like that. And I also do a lot of I do some personal financial planning for my clients and handle a lot of the issues that they deal with there, and just general things. Do a little asset protection work, a little real estate work, and things like that. So had an opportunity really to experience a lot of things, and sometimes the best way to learn is through somebody else's experience. The worst way to learn.
In other words, learn at somebody else's expense.
That's right. The worst way to learn it is at your own experience, your own expense, because that is very expensive. And I have a lot of those lessons in my background. So,
but you retain that information very well.
Oh, I've got scars.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
So it doesn't take long. I've got some scars. So the so that's my background, a little bit about my background and where I'm at and what I do. And how I participate. But so I don't have a direct economics background, although I do have a couple master's courses in economics, and I have a undergraduate degree in accounting. And of course, anybody that knows accountants knows that they think that the economics people are all wrong because that's not real income. Economic income is not income, and we think they can't be accounted for correctly. So, but I do appreciate the economics, and
I love your explanation of the difference between an accountant and a CPA. And if you recall, of course, you know this, right? This is your routine, but I love this because I committed it to memory.
Okay.
So you know that it was profound in my thinking.
All right. Well, maybe you better tell me because
All right.
I've forgotten.
All right. So you said that an accountant will tell you 1 and 1 is 2, 2 and 2 is 4.
Oh, yes.
So these are fact-based information. But if you ask an accountant how much is 2 and 2,
A CPA.
or a CPA rather, how much is 2 and 2, a CPA will tell you what do you want it to be?
That's right.
Yes.
That's what we do.
Yes.
That's what we do. If we do a good job, that's what we do.
I found that to be very profound, and it did stick with me. Yes.
I forgot about that, but yes, that is the.
I didn't.
That is the definition of a CPA. So, and that is actually, it's funny because it's kind of interesting because on the accounting side there is some latitude and some things that happen. On the economic side, it's interesting that economic principles go through gyrations. It's more theory. Accounting is there's some practical side to it. The economic side of it, there's a lot of theory to it and practical implementation of the theory. But it's funny from an economic standpoint, there have been theories that have come and gone and they gain favor and go away. And you hear them referred to, for example, as supply side economics or Keynesian economics, or there was the Chicago School for a while that was talking about a lot of the economics in the finance world, and it was but in general, we've dealt from an economic standpoint with some basic sets of principles, and they hold true, and I like to talk about them because it's where politicians on both sides tend to make what I think are major mistakes relative to economics and finance. And it's funny.
Well, they're pandering to their base.
Well, yes.
There's a lot of that,
and they also understand that a lot of economics is involved, or a lot of the economics in the U.S. is based on a free market concept, capitalism and free market concept, and so in general, the free market concept is based on only works. Capitalism only works if you have equal strength on both sides
Hmm.
of the equation. Usually that's equal numbers. That's, so you've got an equal, the definition, of equilibrium price, which is considered to be fair price, is where you have an equal number of buyers and sellers who basically come to the market and negotiate the price in mass. And because you have an equal number of sellers and buyers, you get a give and take. So the price drops to equilibrium. That's the price that's a fair price to the buyer and a fair price to the seller. All right.
All right.
And so in economics that works, in capitalism that works.
Yeah.
Assuming,
But capitalism also works in the sense that there are winners and losers, and not everybody's a winner in the capitalist system.
actually, in the capitalistic system,
And I mean, but that's okay. I mean, that's
actually in the capitalistic system, if it works correctly,
yeah.
everybody is a winner and
Yeah.
everybody's a loser.
Everybody's a
Because the idea is that in a pure capitalistic system,
right.
everybody gets a negotiated amount. So
Right.
if you want to look at it that way, everybody loses because they don't get what they exactly want.
Right.
And everybody wins because they get exactly what they should. Okay.
Mhm.
And that's the concept. That's what we forget.
This is the theory.
Well, that's
But
practice.
That's the practical application.
So the only
All right.
time you get a situation where time you get a situation where somebody wins
Yeah.
and somebody loses is where you don't truly have a free market. So that's the problem with capitalism is not by its nature, by itself, a good thing if you don't have a strong market on equal sides.
Right.
For example,
Well, when the government weighs in and the too big to fail and all that type
No,
of thing,
no,
that's
and-
when you get into trouble. though.
no, that's where they're needed if they're right. And see, this is where people get confused sometimes
Yeah.
because a lot of times you'll hear, and this is on the Republican side. A lot of
Mhm.
times there's a lot of confusion there, and they'll say, well, the government should stay out of a market.
Yeah.
Well, no. In economically, the government has an obligation to step into a market that won't produce an equilibrium price, because otherwise some side of the equation will be victimized. So what I'm getting at is, let's take the insurance market.
All right.
There's maybe 4 major insurance companies in the world, in
Mhm.
the United States, at least health insurance I'm talking
Mhm.
now. If you left it up to the market to set price on health insurance, there's no competition for those insurance companies. And that's why,
Right.
a lot of people couldn't understand. We talked about this before on the show, that a lot of people couldn't understand why the insurance companies, if the Affordable Care Act wasn't a good plan, why were the insurance companies behind it? If it was really going to be that damaging to the
Because they
insurance,
knew they were getting a monopoly.
they knew that
Right.
ultimately all of those small players couldn't participate. They
Right.
would fall out
Right.
because
Right.
they couldn't match that price.
Right.
And sometimes a competitor will come into a market, and if they're too strong, and that's what is, let's say I'm a seller in the market.
Yeah.
Okay. So if there's no competition, I can set my price as high as I want. All right. Because I have the ability to do that. Nobody's going to make me do it.
Right.
But sometimes when I'm powerful and there is some competition, so that it is a free market right now, but I'm big enough, if I'm big enough that I can come into that market on the selling side and I can drop my price below my competitors' costs.
Right. Like Walmart did in pharmacy.
Right.
Yes.
Any of those things.
Right.
And you can come in and drop your price
Mhm.
so that at some point they can't compete with you.
Right.
And actually, here's how they do it. Is if I'm big enough, I have a base level of fixed costs.
Mm.
Those are costs that just to open the door, I incur those costs. I don't have to do anything. I've got those costs.
Right.
And I'm going to have them whether I sell one insurance policy, health insurance policy, or I sell 1 million health insurance policies. All right. So if I've already got a base of work, if I've already got a guaranteed base of work, let's take Blue Cross Blue Shield of Florida. Blue Cross Blue Shield of Florida already has a base of work because they administer the Medicare program in
Right.
Florida.
They have a
right?
captive audience.
Right. So they know they're going to have that business. And
Right.
that business, they know they can cover to some degree their fixed costs.
Mhm.
So now when they go into another market, all they have to do is cover their variable costs. That's the incremental cost that they incur to add additional business. So typically that if you were in the manufacturing area, that would be just the materials and the labor that it takes to build something. It's not your building, your plant, or anything like that. In the insurance world, it's actually the computer technology and the people to answer the phone and
Mhm.
administer the policies nowadays. It used to be the sales force, and it still is, but those sales force now is online basically, and they already have a lot of the computer system because they already have the sales system in place. So they already have that. So when it comes time for you, so you're going on to the Affordable Care Act and to go on to select a policy. And you look at those policies and there's all of these ones that you can compare, right? And some of them are very, very high.
Yes.
And
Cadillac plans.
well, and no, they're not Cadillac plans. For the same stuff, they're higher than
Oh.
Blue Cross Blue Shield.
Oh, I see.
And the reason is Blue Cross Blue Shield is using what's called predatory pricing.
Right.
And they know why they're doing that because they can price at break even,
Right.
capture the market, force all of the smaller competitors out, capture the market. And the way health insurance is established and run right now in the United States, you actually have to buy from an insurance company that's approved
Right.
in your state. So,
Right.
so let's say I'm in Florida and I decide I'm from Michigan originally, and I know Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan because it was a great program, Blue Cross Blue Shield of
Sure.
Michigan, right?
Yep.
So I go to Michigan and want to get Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan, which is a different company than Blue Cross Blue Shield of
It
Florida.
is entirely.
They're not approved to write in the state of Florida.
Yeah.
So you say, well, that's not practical. That doesn't happen. Absolutely, it happens. What happened in the health insurance environment is a couple of the organizations like the Chamber of Commerce's and trade associations
Right.
that want to offer health insurance to their members that are small businesses. They went to Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan and say, can you provide this? Because we provide this nationwide.
Right.
But the problem is you get into an issue where Blue Cross Blue Shield of Florida doesn't want them in here.
Right.
So they go to the insurance commissioner and say, they're not licensed to write in this state. They can't provide that insurance.
Right.
So that's what happens. So in a free market system, you have to be aware of when and where you don't have a free market. And that's still capitalism, but it's the negative side of capitalism.
Right.
And so you have to agree with certain people. You from an economic standpoint, when somebody talks about we need to get people out of the get government out of certain things, and we have to have a private sector. Well, in insurance, you cannot have a private sector.
Yeah,
it doesn't exist right now, and in fact, that's why realistically, as soon as the Affordable Care Act went into place, all of the individual policies that you could get, group or otherwise, all went to their pricing.
Right.
Because that's the alternative.
Right.
Somebody drops their insurance and says, go ahead and do this. So realistically, in the insurance area, in the health insurance area, you can't have a free system. You have to have government intervention to regulate price. But the difficulty there is that now you could try to do things to create a more competitive system. And that's why, and create pockets of competition in certain areas.
The government weighs in. So what you're saying is the government weighs in when they see that there's a public benefit. Otherwise, they take a hands-off approach.
Not necessarily a public benefit. That's what they shouldn't be doing.
Right.
In other words, they shouldn't necessarily be weighing in to give the person a price that's below what they would get in a free market.
Right.
And that's just as bad because now the government controls the market,
right?
And there's no competition, and the government's inefficient, so their pricing so their fixed costs are much higher than Blue Cross Blue Shield's fixed costs. So
Mhm.
so let's say, for example, I had Blue Cross Blue Shield or the U.S. government's Medicare program,
Mhm.
and I wanted one of those two to administer my nationwide health insurance.
Mhm.
Well, I would much rather have Blue Cross Blue Shield, as much as I dislike some of the stuff they do. I'd much rather have them administer the program than the U.S. government, because the U.S. government has a much, much higher level of overhead. They pay more for things. They have a higher level of overhead.
Right.
Even
More
in-
bureaucratic expense.
Right.
Mhm.
And so their fixed costs are much higher.
Yeah.
So even if they were trying to get the market to price at variable cost only, and once they've covered their fixed costs, the fixed costs are higher. So, and that's why the Medicaid system has switched from a cost reimbursement system to almost a fee for service type concept. Now what happens in the Medicaid world, because the government finally realized, wait a minute, if I'm pricing at cost plus, there's no incentive to control costs.
Right.
Costs will be whatever I can
Right.
get them to be, and the more costs I can get, the higher my price.
Right.
Right? So people are trying to dump everything into cost. So then the government comes in and says, well, you can't include this as part of the cost. You can't include this. You cannot include this as part of the cost. So what happened is they're starting to throw that out.
Right.
Well, then what happens is that you get to a point where, a company, and let's say in Florida, let's take Medicare in Florida. If you're a doctor's office in Florida, probably 70% of your revenue is coming from Medicare, right?
Mm.
So that leaves 30% of your revenue to cover all of your fixed costs, your overhead, if Medicare says we're not covering overhead.
Right.
And that's really what Medicare tries to do and Medicaid tries to do. They come in and say, we're not going to cover overhead. This is additional business. And that's the fallacy and see, that's why the market changes. Government doesn't react fast enough.
Yeah.
I mean, what happened in the Medicare and Medicaid area is, first of all, they priced it cost plus. By the time the government figured out that they had screwed it up, they try to make changes to that. They try to make changes to that market. Then what they do is, but by then the market has already moved to what the government wanted them to do.
Yeah.
In other words, if on the supply side, that's the government that is supplying the healthcare benefits,
Mm.
and I'm the consumer, and there's gazillions of us consumers, right?
Mm-hmm.
If on our side of the equation, because there's gazillions of us, we will move instantaneously to whatever makes the most sense for us.
Right.
So if the government comes in and prices Medicare below private insurance, we will immediately move to Medicare.
Right.
Right? I mean, we'll immediately go that way. Even though we might have an offer, an opportunity through our business to get health insurance, but it's cheaper.
Yeah.
So what happens? Well, the concept behind Medicare and behind Medicaid was that it was incremental to the insurance companies or to the doctors. So the doctor would take this additional patient. They don't have to cover overhead out of this patient because they're incremental. And in a lot of places in the United States, that's true. Medicare might represent less than 20% of 20 or 25% of a doctor's practice in Peoria, Illinois, where I was from.
Mm.
Okay. But in Florida, they represent 70%. Well, in the place where they represent 20 or 25%, you got 75 or 80% of private insurance to make a profit on to cover the overhead. So yes, it actually is incremental. So at that point, you don't need those dollars to cover your overhead. All you got to do is make sure you cover your base costs, your additional personnel, your additional supplies costs, and that kind of thing. And once you've done that, it's pretty cheap. All right. Once you don't have to cover all of the equipment, the overhead, and all of that, it's pretty cheap. So that made sense there, but it doesn't make sense in Florida because you've got all these retired people that are coming in here in
Right.
Florida,
Sucking up the resources. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So now you've got 30% of your income that you have to cover 70% of your costs,
Right.
of your overhead costs, and you can't do it through the Medicare program; they won't let you, or through the Medicaid program. So now you've got to do it here. So that's why I'm saying you get the response you want.
Yeah.
You just don't. It may not be the response you thought. That's the thing I love about economics is that if you study it, you will know what you're going to get, even if you didn't want it. The bad thing about economics is people ignore it because it's complicated, and so they
Oh, it's like 3D chess.
yeah they choose not
Yeah.
to deal with it. And
Yeah.
and I tell you what, economics isn't as difficult as it looks if you break down the steps in between.
Mhm.
It's really interesting. Economics can be extremely complicated in the micro basis when you're looking at individual in the private industry, and you're looking at various segments of things like labor costs and how labor costs are determined,
Mhm.
and what's fair price in labor, and those kind of things.
Right.
That can get very complicated, and how that occurs can get very complicated. But in the whole scheme of things, that all flushes out on the big picture level.
Right.
In other words, it's kind of one of these things where you can go on a micro level, you're looking at all kinds of variables and things that come into play. But on the macro level, over a relatively short period of time and in a competitive market, all that goes away. You just get your results, and it happens quickly. I mean, the example of that is the stock market.
Mhm.
The stock market is probably as competitive of a market as you can get,
That's pretty knee jerk too, though.
because
Yeah. It's
there's a
emotion.
bunch of suppliers and a bunch of buyers, and
Right.
and a bunch of sellers, a bunch of buyers, and they're all
And-
ready to do it instantaneously.
They are, and they're sometimes emotionally driven rather than fact driven.
Yeah,
and that's what makes it so
Well,
emotionally charged.
But the interesting thing is that falls out.
Yeah.
Because the emotional, that's why the market is,
It will, yeah. I mean, it'll spike or drop,
but
and level out.
actually,
Yes.
and that's probably caused more by computer trading.
Hmm.
Nowadays, there's to take the emotion out of the market. There a lot of the large firms use trading portfolio software that, and they're not necessarily trading, but what they're doing is they're saying, okay, if the market moves this much, we're selling. If the market moves this much and below this level, we're selling. If it goes here, we're buying. And here's the level we're buying. If it does this again, here's a stop. If it does it tonight, we're stopping again. If it does it again, we're out completely. If it does this, we're back in. And that's all driven by computer programming based on statistics and numbers and things. And there's no emotion involved at all. Now, what's happening is the consumer is sitting at home taking it in the shorts. And because they're not privy to all of this, and they're going nuts, right? And they're making really bad decisions. And that's why, ultimately, nobody can control the market, because if they did, they would be extremely wealthy.
Right.
The only person that comes kind of close a little bit are some of these influencers, and only in the short run. Guys like Buffett, for example. When Buffett says something, a lot of people react to it.
Right.
Right now, when President Trump says something, a lot of people react to it.
Mhm.
Right now, when China says something, a lot of people react. And so you do get those emotional reactions that can produce in the short run an economic result that a politician or somebody else is looking for, or not looking for.
Right.
But in the long run, that will flush out, because in the long run, the market is driven by profits.
Yeah.
And by real profits. It's priced based on expected profits. So ultimately, if the company doesn't meet those expectations that the market is priced on, the expectations will fall and price will fall. So you say, how do they determine what's the value of General Motors? It's determined every single second on Wall Street based on what a buyer's willing to pay for that stock and what a seller's willing to sell it at. And it happens, and it becomes a fair price, because there are all these people that are looking at it. Even if General Motors, to some degree, is a monopoly, its stock price will be affected by it's still a free market on the transfer of its stock. It's not a free market in its business. At least it wasn't. It's becoming more and more, because there are more and more manufacturers. But in the day, there was only four manufacturers and no competition.
Right.
So, and in fact, in most economic studies in the past that are as old as me, the classic oligopoly, which are basically kind of more than one and less than four, or four and less, is considered to be the auto industry. It was it.
Mhm.
And so what happens with that market is that it does move instantaneously. And that's important to understand, because it affects other things in economics. So that's why I say when you look at individual things, you start looking at segments of the market, and you say, well, that's competitive. So you look at General Motors stock price, and you say, well, there's thousands of, that's a competitive market, and it is. So should the stock market be regulated? Should the price of General Motors be regulated on the stock market? No. It is to some degree the numbers that underlie the price is regulated.
Right.
The Securities and Exchange Commission requires audits. The PCAOB requires audits that that are open to public to the shareholders, public scrutiny. They have to follow certain principles and all that kind of stuff. So that is regulated, and parts of things are so that aspects of that market can be free. But the actual price, if you actually went on, to NASDAQ or to New York Stock Exchange, said, this price can't go below here, can't go above here. If you regulated the price that way, that would be a problem, because you would take out what is now a free market,
right,
and you would override that market, and then you would not have equilibrium price. You in effect do that. The government does that when they take over a business. So when the government subsidized General Motors, they affected the price because they affected the profit stream.
Well, and of course, then what about the bondholders? That's a lot of folks ended up holding the bag.
Yeah. All of those kind of things that
was government
intervention.
Intervention
and that was done for what they thought would be a good thing.
Right. Altruistic. Yeah.
Right. But in the long run, it didn't.
Right.
And here's what happens.
This is why I don't like government getting involved.
Well, when it's not necessary,
right.
The government
GM could have failed.
Right.
And the result probably would have ended up better for the consumer. Ultimately,
it would have been actually, and this is where people don't understand it, because there's a lot of what they call disruption in the short run.
Yeah.
When a market changes, there's disruption, and it doesn't help everybody. So say, for example, you're 55 years old and General Motors closes down and you lose your job,
right.
A nice union job on the floor that you have seniority in, you lose that job at 55. All right. Well, you've got some retirement, but you can't go out and train for another job for even in the auto industry for some of the new types of stuff that's out there, because that was one of the problems.
Yeah.
General Motors technology was behind, so because they couldn't afford to replace all of that. They couldn't afford to computerize a lot of things. So what happens is, in the short run, the disruption can be very, very difficult.
Yes.
And that's where the government can do good. So you don't step into the market to stop the disruption. You step into the market to provide the safety net if the change does more damage to the individual. So, for example, that's why we have why we have an employment compensation benefits. That's why we have retraining tools for younger workers. That's why we potentially have pension plans that are guaranteed, so that if you've had a company that's provided a pension plan and they go out of business and fail and can't cover the pension benefits, that you've got you don't lose everything after working all your life. It's the same thing with it's why we have to have a public health insurance option like Medicaid, because if you lose your job and you can't afford insurance, you have to have some kind of coverage. So that's where, from an economic standpoint, the government can step in and do good. They can be the safety net. What you don't want them to do is cut the dang trapeze on purpose, thinking they're doing good, and then creating a safety net that can't possibly be managed.
Right.
And what happens, and what I'm getting at is that
there's the strike going on right now.
Right.
GM. Okay. And so they've theoretically have lost about $1 billion. But the UAW's lost $600 million.
Right.
So they're both losers. But in the meantime, people don't realize this. The sun never sets on GM. GM is actually building more cars overseas annually, even whether you plug in the U.S. domestic production work or not, it's the U.S. is actually a minor player now in the global business of GM.
Well, and
So
and you got to keep in mind that the negotiation for that is not just GM.
Right.
In other words, what the United Auto Workers does when they negotiate a contract is they pick the most vulnerable spot,
right,
and the largest, but they pick the most vulnerable. So they'll also be going after somebody who's UAW,
right,
who is not quite that strong. They will go after somebody like a Caterpillar tractor,
mm-hmm.
or a John Deere, or who all have union people,
mm-hmm.
same UAW people. They'll go after the weakest of the manufacturers. But here again,
and isn't that the understanding that once they get an agreement that the other manufacturers adopt that agreement?
That's usually what comes about, because there's UAW there, and they're going to say, well, we want the same benefits as, so they're basically doing a contract for everybody at the same time.
Correct.
But you're right. What happens in that situation, and what people don't realize, is those contracts are going to be structured such that the benefits are largely going to go to the senior people, senior in age, senior in longevity in the company. Okay. It's the way always the union contracts go. And then it's trickle down. I love it because trickle down economics occurs big time in unions, because the benefits go to the top people. And a lot of times it goes that way, and then trickles down to the entry level positions, because they don't need new entry level people. They don't care.
Right.
The union, they want to take care of the people that are, supporting them and making the money. But what will happen is that if there's no competition, those labor costs, GM will suck up quality labor. All right. Because if you're in the auto industry and you want high wages, you're going to go where you get paid high wages.
Yeah.
And so you're going to go to GM or Ford or someplace else. If you were at Nissan, and maybe not in a non-union plant down in, Nashville or someplace, you're going to say, oh, gee, these guys are getting, 8 times what I'm getting, or 3 times. So there's also competition to the union from non-union workers in their same plant in General Motors. And that's exactly what you're seeing. So the first thing the company will do, as being kind of equal to the union, and that's what we're talking about. There's not large numbers, but they're equal strengths.
Yeah.
Potentially. So what happens is General Motors will start shifting work to their lowest cost labor force. And that's what I wanted to get to. And I want to kind of explain that. Basically, from an economic standpoint, let's take the auto industry. It's comprised, your costs, and this is why accountants disagree, because the definition of cost and income from an accounting standpoint and producing a profit from an accounting standpoint is completely different than the definition of costs, income, and profit in the economic standpoint.
Right.
So let's talk about in a economic standpoint, an entity has a number of costs. So what you have is labor, which we've been talking about.
Right.
You have materials, and equipment.
Right.
So you got materials, you got equipment, and to produce this stuff, and from an accounting standpoint, that's kind of what we would consider to be economic costs.
Right.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But in the economic world, we add to those accounting costs, we add 2 things that people don't think about. One is taxes. Taxes are a cost.
Yeah, they are.
They are not something that the company pays.
Right. Consumers pay.
The costs are paid.
Passed on.
They're passed on.
Right.
And those costs, because otherwise, if they don't cover those costs, they go out of business.
Right.
So cost is a number, and then profit, economic return on equity to the capital, to the return on capital to the shareholders
Mhm.
is another cost.
Mhm.
And if any of those costs are adjusted, the company has to adjust some other cost the other way.
Mhm.
All right. Otherwise, they will go out of business.
Right.
And so why is that? So I love it when we hear politicians, and this gets me because I know they know this. And you never hear an analysis of it on any of the shows, any right or left. You never hear an analysis of this, but you'll hear people say, we're only going to tax the big corporations. I heard Elizabeth Warren say, how are you going to pay for your health care plan? We're going to tax the corporations. That is an out and out lie.
Sure.
Corporations don't pay tax.
Exactly.
Even if you charge them tax, they
100%.
do not pay tax.
Exactly.
Because they will have to, because tax are a cost.
They'll have to pass
And
it
if
on.
you increase their tax costs,
Mhm.
they have to reduce or change something else. So what happens with a tax increase to a corporation is they will either A, lay off people,
Right.
all right, lay off people to offset their tax costs. They will try to cut materials. They'll use cheaper materials. They will not buy US. They'll go to China. They'll go to India. They'll go to Pakistan because they will go with the cheapest possible because they will try to reduce the
Overhead
materials
expense.
cost
Mhm. Mhm.
if they haven't already. Now, part of the problem is in a competitive environment, they've already done this stuff.
Right.
They're
So now
already
they
got
have to cut deeper. Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
Now they have to actually pull down.
Right.
And so you have to contract the economy at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Individually, you're contracting, but all over the economy, if that's happening all over the economy is going to contract
Mm-hmm.
because you can't afford as much materials. You can't afford as much labor. You've got to square that down because you have to keep your profit up.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you'll hear them say, well, we're going to tax these billionaires, these rich people that own these companies. Well, you know who you're taxing? The UAW,
Mm-hmm.
unions, teachers unions, labor unions,
Right. They're taking money out
retirement
of
plans.
Right.
They are the ones that are buying all of this. So if they own General Motors, and trust me, the UAW workers, they probably have a large investment in Ford and GM and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
So now, if they were making 6%, which is what they need for retirement to be able to retire, okay,
Mm-hmm.
and actually what their pension plan is based on, and now all of a sudden you're going to tax that entity and increase its costs so that the profits go down, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
As a consumer, you're going to sell it, right? I'm going to sell it and buy something else. I'm either going to buy something in the industry if I can find it, but if the industry is being affected, I'm going to buy something in another industry that I can make the same return with the same amount of risk.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's done across the board in the US, what am I going to do? I'm going to go to overseas, right?
Mm-hmm.
So why do you think the overseas market is suffering right now? Because we're producing higher profits
Mm-hmm.
than they are overseas. Overseas investors are buying stocks in US companies right now.
Sure.
That's pushing the market up because they can get a higher profit. So what is happening? These high tax countries like France and Germany and some of those, as they increase taxes further, their investors leave and they can't understand why their business contracts. Their business contracts because the business doesn't have any capital anymore. It can't expand because it's having to pay its investors out. So now it either has to borrow money, which increases its cost of capital, which then causes it more problems. It has to contract further. So the net effect is that you have to look at it from an economic standpoint. You can't tax a corporation.
Mm-hmm.
You can shift money, but so let's say if you don't want to lose your investors and you got to pay the tax and you can't contract materials any longer and you can't do anything with labor, right? And the market's being affected by labor too. Now that the economy is stronger, labor wants more money. They want a bigger percentage of that.
That's right.
And
that's
that's right.
Yeah.
That's rightfully so. That's what happens in a free market system. They want more money.
Right.
And now how that money gets distributed, if it gets distributed to people who frankly are already overpaid for what they're doing, it does nothing. It's an inefficient deal. But if it gets redistributed, if that labor gets substituted, more things get mechanized, i.e. McDonald's now has kiosks, and so does everybody else in the world.
Right.
So they could get rid of the basic job.
Right.
So is that person that used to make $10 or $12 an hour working the counter at McDonald's or Wendy's, are they making more money now?
Yeah.
No, they're gone. Their
Yeah.
job is not, they're not working now. Now they're unemployed. The government's paying them. And we're going to have to tax somebody to do that. That's the way it works. Businesses will move to equilibrium
Right.
when there's competition. Now, what could I do? I can increase the price. That's what I can do. Now, I can't increase the price if my price is going to increase more than somebody else's. So I'm stuck. But if I tax everybody, then what we'll do is we'll increase the price.
Right.
What does that mean? Inflation.
Sure.
Inflation is the worst tax that government can levy. And this is what irritates me about politicians. It irritates me that they do or don't understand the economics of corporate tax and how it works and what impact it truly has on people. But what really gets me is either they're too stupid or liars and cheats.
They're naive. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
either way,
Yeah.
they're sitting there. If you're going to sit there and tell people to do something,
Right.
and you don't know what the outcome is, then you shouldn't be doing it. And if you do know what the outcome is, you're pretty shitty.
Right.
Because the bottom line is,
Yeah.
inflation is a tax that is levied on the poor.
Yeah.
Because I can't shift my buying if I'm poor. I have to buy food. I have to buy clothes. All of my housing, all of those things become a larger portion of my income. And I don't have discretionary money. So if I get inflation, I have a large amount of discretionary income, I can choose not to pay that tax. I don't have to buy that item. But if I'm poor or working poor and I have to buy that, then it taxes me worse.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what do? Well, now instead of addressing the problem, instead of getting in there and getting where the market screwed up, what we do instead is we now try to subsidize again.
Yeah.
So now we go in and we say, okay, we'll subsidize your food through food stamps. We'll subsidize your food. We'll subsidize your health care. We'll subsidize your clothing. We'll subsidize your cell phone, right? We'll subsidize all this stuff. But how do we subsidize it? Well, by taking taxes from people that are causing the problem to start with, who are then increasing their price again, who are passing that price along. Now, what happens? At some point, we subsidize below a certain income level, we subsidize everybody,
Right.
whether they need the subsidy or not.
Sure, because they all have to be treated equally.
And some people do need subsidies.
Right.
There are people that are disabled. There are people that have that have certain things that, and sometimes it's temporary, but there are people that can't get into the workforce or temporarily out of the workforce. Maybe they were having a family and now they're trying to get back in, and they can't, they don't have the education yet. So we have people that do need that safety net for some period of time. And when we spread that safety net to those people who don't need it, either because we want to, or because we don't realize we're doing it through inflation or through other means, through loss of jobs that we're creating because of artificially high labor rates or whatever, then what we do is we create now a situation where we're moving that pain from spreading it across everybody. We've now eliminated the rich because they have more discretionary income. They just won't buy, or they'll buy overseas or someplace else where it's cheaper.
Right.
Right. So they just don't buy. We've eliminated the poor based on what we define as poor. I always like it. The government never defines rich and they never define poor. Okay. I will tell you that
middle income is what they'll define.
They don't even define that because you have to define rich and poor. So what they do is they let middle income suffer. And then it finds its equilibrium. So the poor is at whatever level we now decide to extend benefits to, right? That's now poor. Rich is basically whatever we've defined in the tax code as rich, because largely we do all this social stuff through the tax code. So basically rich is a married couple making over $315,000 a year. An individual making over $157,500. Poor is generally someone under 65,000. So what we've now taken is a single couple or a married between the income of about $70,000 and 300 or 150 if you're an individual. We've taken that income level and you're going to pay all the taxes. You're going to do everything. You're going to pay all the taxes. Frankly, that and businesses that are solely owned by individuals, they're pass-through entities, local businesses, they take the brunt of it because they can't pass that on. They can't sell their stock.
Right.
But what they will do is retire. They'll get out of the business. They'll stop doing it. They won't pay anymore because they can't. They'll get behind on their taxes, which they do. So the bottom line is that, people need to, the individual components are what they are, but anytime that the government gets involved in a market that doesn't need to be regulated and tries to help, the old saying, I'm from the government, I'm here to help.
Yeah.
Bend over.
Yeah.
Because it's not going to be a good thing.
It's not going to be.
So anyway, it's interesting because I love the concept of capitalism and it is a good thing in practice, but we have to be careful because it can be messed up, especially in the short run.
I'd like to, we're of course out of time, but I'd like to spend maybe an hour. We could talk about the oligopoly of the paint industry. Ironically, it's something I'm profoundly well schooled in.
And then afterwards, just like my last discussion,
watch paint dry.
We can watch the paint dry.
Yes.
So anyway,
it's amazing stuff. But yeah, maybe we could pick this up another time.
Okay. Well, thanks for joining us here on Treasure Coast Solutions. We'll be back next week, 9 to 10 o'clock right here on WSTU, talking about some things hopefully that'll help you out in your day-to-day lives. And, that's the great thing about WSTU. It's here for that purpose. So join us on WSTU Digital 1450. We are Martin County's very, very, very old station.